My ex-husband found out I bought a house for $5 million and rushed to my door. "Where did you get the money? These are our shared savings." He filed a lawsuit the next day. I just laughed. What my lawyer did to him, he will never forget. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The house smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I stood in the entrance hall of my new home. 5 bedrooms, vaulted ceilings, a garden that backed up to a small creek. And I let myself cry, not from sadness, from the sheer bone-deep relief of it. 3 years. 3 years of rebuilding myself from the rubble of a marriage that had taken more than I'd ever admitted. And here I was, standing on hardwood floors I'd chosen myself, in a house that belonged to no one but me. That moment felt like the closing of a very long chapter. But let me go back, because the end only makes sense when you understand the beginning. Marcus and I met at a fundraiser in downtown Dallas in the spring of 2009. He was charming in that particular way some men are. Not handsome exactly, but magnetic, confident without being loud. He ran a mid-size construction company his father had started, and he carried himself like a man who knew exactly where he was going. I was 31, working as a marketing director for a healthcare group, and I thought I knew what I wanted. I thought I recognized something solid in Marcus Harmon. We married in 2011. The early years were good. Genuinely good, not the kind of good you have to remind yourself of. We built a life together in the Preston Hollow neighborhood of Dallas. We traveled. We talked about children, but agreed we were in no rush. I poured myself into my career, and he poured himself into his business. And for a while, that felt like partnership. The first cracks appeared so slowly I almost missed them. It started with the phone. Marcus had always been protective of his privacy. I'd chalked it up to professionalism, to client confidentiality. But sometime around 2017, I noticed he'd started leaving the room to take calls. Not stepping out, leaving, closing doors, coming back with his expression carefully rearranged. I told myself he was stressed. The construction market had been difficult. I was good at telling myself things. Then came the receipts. I found one in the pocket of a jacket I was sending to the dry cleaner, dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never been to, on a Tuesday night when he'd told me he had a late meeting with subcontractors. I held that slip of paper for a long time. The amount was small, the implication was not. I didn't confront him, not then. I watched instead. I paid attention in a way I hadn't for years, and what I saw made my stomach turn quietly for months. A weekend trip that he claimed was a conference in Houston. I found out through a mutual friend that the conference had been canceled weeks earlier. Text messages he deleted so quickly it looked practiced. A credit card statement with a hotel charge that didn't match any trip I knew about. By 2019, I knew. I didn't have proof of everything, but I knew the shape of it. The lies had become architectural. Load-bearing walls of deception, holding up a version of our marriage that had never been real. We filed for divorce in early 2020. It was brutal in the way that divorces always are when one person still believed and the other had been performing. Marcus hired an aggressive attorney named Phil Garrett, who specialized in making the other spouse feel like they were lucky to leave with anything. I was so emotionally depleted by then that I let myself be pushed into a settlement I'd later learn was deeply unfair. I walked away with our joint savings account, roughly $380,000, and my car and my personal belongings. Marcus kept the house, the investment portfolio, and full operational control of Harmon Construction. I moved into a rental apartment in Lakewood and tried to remember who I was. What Marcus didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn because he'd never been particularly curious about my life before him, was that my grandmother, Ruth Morrison, had been a shrewd woman, a real estate investor who'd accumulated significant assets over 4 decades in the Phoenix market. When she died in 2016, she left me a trust. It wasn't accessible immediately. Under the terms she'd set, I couldn't touch the principal until I turned 40. She'd been deliberate about that. She wanted to make sure I'd have it when I was ready for it, not when I was young and impulsive. I turned 40 in June 2022. By then, I had a new financial advisor named Carol Weiss, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who wore sensible shoes and talked about money the way a doctor talks about health, factually, without sentiment. Carol helped me understand exactly what I had. The trust's principal, grown by careful management over 6 years, was worth just over $6 million. I sat across from her in her office on McKinney Avenue and read that number twice. I bought the house in November 2022, $5.2 million for a property in Highland Park, a home with history, with a garden, with the kind of quiet elegance my grandmother would have approved of. I paid in full using trust funds. I signed the papers with a steady hand and felt something settle inside me. Marcus found out 3 weeks later. I still don't know exactly how. A mutual acquaintance, perhaps. Or the property records. Those are public. It doesn't matter. What matters is that on a cold Saturday morning in December, my doorbell rang, and when I looked at the security camera on my phone, I saw him standing on my front steps. I opened the door. He looked around at the facade of the house, the limestone exterior, the iron gate, the old oak trees, and his jaw was tight in a way I recognized. That was his jealous face. His "I deserve this" face. Claire. His voice was quiet, which was worse than if he'd been shouting. "Where did you get the money for this?" I looked at him for a long moment. The man I'd spent 11 years of my life building something with. The man who'd lied to my face while I'd been faithful, trusting, and foolish. "I'm sorry," I said. "This house." He gestured broadly. $5 million, Claire. We had savings, joint savings. I took what was agreed upon in our divorce settlement, I said. Which you negotiated, Marcus. Your attorney negotiated it. There's no way $380,000 turned into this. You had money hidden somewhere. That's our money. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out clean and clear in the cold December air. "Good morning, Marcus," I said, and I closed the door. He called me 4 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. The next morning, I received a call from a process server. Marcus had filed suit against me, claiming that the funds used to purchase the property were marital assets that had been concealed during our divorce proceedings. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at my new kitchen table with its view of the creek, and thought, let him come. The lawsuit papers were 11 pages long. I read every word. Marcus's attorney, Phil Garrett again, the same bulldog in the same expensive suit, had drafted a complaint that alleged I had deliberately concealed significant financial assets during our divorce proceedings, that these assets constituted marital property under Texas law, and that the purchase of the Highland Park property represented the use of funds that legally belonged, in part, to Marcus Harmon. He was seeking 50% of the property's appraised value, or alternatively, a forced sale and equitable division of the proceeds. I set the papers down on my kitchen table and looked out at the creek. A pair of mockingbirds were arguing in the oak tree. Life, indifferent and busy, was going on around me. Here was the thing that Marcus had never understood about me, even in 11 years of marriage. I was not a dramatic person. I didn't fall apart easily. What I did, what I had always done, what my grandmother Ruth had modeled for me with her calm, long-game approach to everything, was think. When things went wrong, I got very, very quiet, and I thought them through. So I sat at that table with my coffee going cold, and I thought. The first thing I needed to understand was exactly what I was facing, not emotionally. I would process that later, probably at 3 in the morning when the house was silent and the fear crept in around the edges. Practically, legally. What did Marcus actually have? What could he argue? And what could I prove? The trust was the center of everything. My grandmother had established it in 2014, 2 years before her death, specifically in my name. She'd been advised by her own estate attorney in Phoenix, a careful woman named Harriet Bloom, who had structured the document with precision. The trust was a separate property instrument. It had been created before Ruth's death, funded with her personal assets, and designated solely for me. At no point had Marcus contributed to it, known its full details, or been named in any capacity. Under Texas law, which maintains a strong distinction between separate property and marital property, a gift or inheritance received by one spouse remains that spouse's separate property even during the marriage, as long as it isn't commingled with marital funds. I had never commingled a cent. The trust account had sat, untouched and separate, managed by a Phoenix-based trust administration firm called Sunstate Fiduciary Services, for 6 years. The funds used to purchase the Highland Park house had been wired directly from the trust account to the title company. There was no detour through any joint account, no mixing, no muddying. Marcus had nothing. But, and this was the part that kept me up that first night, nothing was not the same as safe. Litigation was expensive. Phil Garrett was good at making cases look stronger than they were. A drawn-out court battle could drain my energy, my resources, and my peace of mind, even if I ultimately won. I'd seen it happen to other people. I knew that being right and being protected were not the same thing. What I needed was not just a defense. I needed an offense. Because here was the other thing I'd been quietly sitting with since the divorce. The thing I'd never had the energy to pursue when I was just trying to survive those first raw months alone. During our divorce proceedings, something had felt wrong about Marcus's financial disclosures. His business, Harmon Construction, had been doing well through 2019. I knew that. I'd seen the revenues, attended a company anniversary dinner where his project manager had bragged about their backlog of contracts. But in Marcus's divorce filings, the company had been valued at a number that seemed low. Suspiciously, conveniently low. At the time, I hadn't had the bandwidth to dig into it. I'd been emotionally gutted and legally outgunned, and I'd trusted the process more than I should have. I'd signed what was put in front of me and escaped. But now Marcus had come to my door. He'd poked something he should have left alone. And for the first time in 3 years, I had both the resources and the reason to look closely. I picked up my phone and called Carol Weiss. "He filed suit," I said when she answered. A pause. "I see." Carol was not a woman who wasted breath on exclamations. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to need a very good attorney," I said. "Not a divorce attorney, a litigation attorney, someone who's comfortable being aggressive." "I know someone," Carol said. "His name is David Chen. He's a partner at Hartley and Morse. I've seen him work. Claire, he's exactly who you want for something like this." I wrote down the name. "And Carol," I added, "I'm also going to need someone to take a hard look at Harmon Construction's financials from 2018 through the divorce, a forensic accountant." Another pause, longer this time. When Carol spoke again, I could hear the shift in her tone, something careful and alert. You think he hid assets? I think there's a reason his business looked half as healthy on paper as it did in real life, I said. I think I was too broken to notice at the time. I'm not broken anymore. I hung up and stood at the window for a long time, watching the creek move. Fear was there. I won't pretend it wasn't. The prospect of a legal fight, of dragging everything back into the open, of Marcus's attorneys trying to paint me as a liar or a cheat. It made my chest tight in a way I hadn't felt in months, but underneath the fear was something else, something that had been building slowly, quietly, like water rising behind a dam. Anger, yes, but cleaner than anger, more purposeful. He came to my door. After everything he'd done, after the lies and the hidden receipts and the punishing divorce settlement, he had come to my door and accused me of stealing from him. He had made a very serious mistake. I opened my laptop and began to document everything I remembered about our divorce proceedings. Dates, figures, discrepancies that had nagged at me and that I'd dismissed. I wrote for 2 hours. When I finally stopped, I had 4 pages of notes and the outline of what would become my plan. The first step was David Chen. The second step was the truth. All of it. Dragged into the light whether Marcus was ready for it or not. David Chen's office was on the 34th floor of a building on Ross Avenue with a view of downtown Dallas that made you feel, on a clear day, like you could see all the way to the edge of consequence. He was 50, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and learned to conserve himself. He shook my hand, offered me water, and before I could begin, he said, "Tell me everything. Don't edit." I didn't edit. I talked for nearly an hour. I told him about the marriage, the divorce, the trust, my grandmother Ruth, and the care she'd taken in structuring it. I told him about my suspicions regarding Harmon Construction's finances. I laid out everything I'd written in my 4 pages of notes. David listened without interrupting, writing occasionally on a yellow legal pad, his expression giving nothing away. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The trust is airtight," he said. "From what you're describing, the sourcing is completely traceable. Ruth Morrison's assets transferred into an irrevocable trust, designated solely in your name, never touched during the marriage. Texas law is clear on this. That money was never marital property. Garrett knows that. Which means this lawsuit isn't really about winning, it's about pressure." "What do you mean?" "Marcus is gambling that you'll settle," David said. "He doesn't expect to win in court. He expects you to get nervous, to calculate the cost of fighting, and to write him a check just to make it stop." He looked at me steadily. "Will you?" "No," I said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but an acknowledgement. "Good. Then we don't just defend, we countersue. If your instincts about the business valuation are correct, Marcus committed perjury in his financial disclosures during the divorce. That's not a civil matter. That's fraud on the court." "Can we prove it?" "That depends on what a forensic accountant finds," he said. "Carol Weiss already mentioned you'd be open to that. I work with a firm, Meridian Forensic Group, based here in Dallas. They're thorough and they're fast. If Marcus hid assets through the company, they'll find it." I retained David that afternoon. The engagement letter was 12 pages long. I signed it without hesitating. The forensic accounting team began their work the following week. To do it properly, they needed access to Harmon Construction's public filings, Tax records submitted to the IRS were a matter of record, as were certain state filings, and David's team also began a formal discovery process as part of the litigation response, which would compel Marcus to produce financial documents going back 5 years. I went home and tried to act normally. That was the hardest part. Marcus, I would later learn from mutual acquaintances, was watching me. His girlfriend, a woman named Tanya Briggs, whom he'd been seeing since before our divorce, though I didn't know that for certain then, had apparently encouraged him to keep pressure on me. People I'd been friendly with during the marriage started reaching out, seemingly casually, asking how I was doing. I recognized it for what it was: reconnaissance. Marcus wanted to know if I was scared. I was careful. I didn't discuss the case with anyone outside of David, Carol, and my best friend Rachel. I went to work. I gardened. I let the mockingbirds argue in my oak tree. 3 weeks after retaining David, I was sitting in my home office when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered. Ms. Harmon? A woman's voice, professional and careful. This is Janet Chu from Meridian Forensic Group. I'm calling because we've completed the preliminary analysis of Harmon Construction's public filings and the documents produced in initial discovery, and I'd like to schedule a time to walk you and Mr. Chen through our findings. Can you give me a preview? I asked. A pause. I'd rather present this formally, she said, but I can tell you that there are significant irregularities. Between 2018 and 2020, it appears that approximately $840,000 was systematically redirected from Harmon Construction's operating accounts through a series of payments to 2 subcontractor entities. Both entities were registered in Nevada. Both appear to have had no actual operations. My hand tightened on the phone. Shell companies. That's our preliminary assessment, yes, Janet said carefully. The payments were structured to appear as legitimate subcontractor expenses. During the divorce valuation in 2020, the company's profit figures for 2018 and 2019 were significantly understated as a result. Had those funds remained in the business, the valuation would have been substantially higher, and your settlement would have reflected that. I sat very still. $840,000, hidden in plain sight behind shell companies in Nevada, while I'd signed a settlement that gave me a fraction of what I was owed. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Not dramatically, just a small, vertiginous shift. The feeling you get when something you'd half suspected turns out to be entirely true. I'd known something was wrong. I'd felt it and dismissed it because I was too exhausted to trust my own instincts. And I'd paid for that in years and in dollars, and in the particular humiliation of walking away from a marriage and feeling grateful for the scraps. But that was then. Thank you, Janet, I said, and my voice was steady. Please set up that meeting with Mr. Chen as soon as possible. I hung up and sat in my quiet office while outside, the winter afternoon light moved across my garden. There it was, the proof, the thing Marcus had counted on me never finding. He'd buried it carefully and assumed I'd move on, that I was too soft, too hurt, too overwhelmed to ever look back. He had underestimated me, comprehensively, and now there was no going back, not for either of us. The meeting with Janet Chu and her team took place on a Thursday morning in David Chen's conference room. Janet was methodical, presenting spreadsheets and cross-reference filings in a way that was quiet and devastating. 2 shell entities, Briarwood Contracting, LLC, and Pacific Ridge Solutions, LLC, had received a combined $843,000 in payments from Harmon Construction between January 2018 and September 2019. Neither entity had any registered employees. Neither had filed payroll taxes. Both had the same registered agent in Reno, Nevada. Tracing backwards through the limited records available, the money appeared to have moved from those entities into a private account in Marcus's name. David made notes throughout. When Janet finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me. "This is more than we need," he said. "For the counterclaim, for the fraud on the court argument, this is comprehensive. Janet, how confident are you in these findings?" "Very confident," she said. "The paper trail is consistent and documentable. Mr. Harmon's divorce attorney may argue that these were legitimate business expenses, but the absence of any work product, any contracts, any deliverables, any correspondence with these entities makes that position very difficult to sustain." I drove home that afternoon in a strange state, not quite calm, not quite excited, something more like clarity, the kind you feel when a long blur finally comes into focus. I made the decision that night. I had been thinking about the house for weeks. The purchase had already gone through. The trust funds had already been dispersed. I was already living there. But in a different sense, I hadn't fully committed. Part of me had been waiting to see what Marcus would do, half expecting that he'd withdraw the lawsuit when he realized he had no legal footing. That hadn't happened. He was pushing forward, apparently convinced that the lawsuit would pressure me into a settlement. It was time to show him what pushing forward actually looked like. I called David. "File the counterclaim," I said. "Fraud on the court, perjury and financial disclosures, and add a claim for the shortfall in the original settlement. If the business had been properly valued, I was owed at a minimum $420,000 more than I received." "Consider it done," David said. "We file Monday." The counterclaim was served on Marcus Harmon the following Wednesday. I know this because at 7:14 that evening he called me. I was in my garden, deadheading the roses along the back fence, and I watched his name appear on my phone screen and let it ring. He didn't leave a voicemail. He came to my house instead. I heard the doorbell at 8:30 p.m. I looked at the security camera. Marcus was on my front steps again, and this time he was not alone. Tanya Briggs stood slightly behind him, tall, dark-haired, her expression a mixture of contempt and rehearsed composure. I'd only seen photos of her before. She was younger than I'd expected. I opened the door. "You filed a counterclaim," Marcus said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, a vibration, like pressure behind glass. "You accused me of fraud." "My attorneys filed a counterclaim," I said, "based on evidence." "Evidence?" He almost laughed. "Those were legitimate business expenses, Claire. You have no idea what you're talking about. Business relationships are complex. Subcontractors who don't exist," I said quietly. "Registered agents in Nevada, no employees, no deliverables, no work product. My attorneys have been very thorough, Marcus." Tanya stepped forward slightly. "You should think carefully about what you're doing," she said. Her voice was smooth, practiced. "This is going to cost you, legally, financially. This is going to become very ugly for you." I looked at her for a moment, then back at Marcus. "You sued me," I said. "You came to my door and accused me of hiding assets. You filed a lawsuit claiming money that was never yours." I kept my voice level. "I'm defending myself. If that makes things ugly, the timeline is important. You started this." "Drop the counterclaim," Marcus said. "Drop it and I'll drop the original suit. We walk away clean." "No," I said. "Claire, no. Good night, Marcus." I closed the door. For a moment, I stood in the entrance hall, listening to the silence of my house. Then I heard their voices, muffled, on the other side of the door. Urgent, clipped. Then footsteps on the stone path. Then a car door and an engine. I walked to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink until my hands stopped trembling. The following day, I called David and reported the visit. He noted it and said calmly that harassment of a party during pending litigation was something the court would not look kindly upon. I made sure to check my security system logs and save the footage. That weekend, I drove to a small inn in the Texas Hill Country and spent 3 days doing almost nothing. I walked along the Guadalupe River. I slept long and dreamlessly. I ate breakfast on a porch with a view of limestone hills and let the quiet do its work. I was in a fight, a real one, with real stakes, and I needed to be whole for it. Not frantic, not reactive, whole. I came back on a Sunday evening to my house, to my garden, to the quiet creek behind the fence. I watered the roses and watched the sky go dark. I was ready. The approach came through Sandra Pell. Sandra had been a peripheral friend during the marriage, the kind who appeared at dinner parties and exchanged pleasantries at school charity events for other people's children. We'd never been close, so when she called me on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, ostensibly to catch up, I knew immediately what it was. We met for coffee at a cafe in Uptown. Sandra was warm and chatty for the first 20 minutes, asking about the new house, about my work, about whether I'd been traveling. Then she set down her cup and her expression shifted into something more careful. "I ran into Marcus last week," she said, as if this were incidental. "Did you?" I said. "He seems stressed." She paused. "He mentioned the lawsuit. Both of them." Another pause. "He said he thinks this has gotten out of hand, that he wishes things could be resolved without all of this." I looked at her. She was doing her best to appear neutral, but there was something in her posture, a slight forward lean and attentiveness, that told me this wasn't a casual observation. "What exactly did he say, Sandra?" She seemed to weigh her options. Then, "He said that if you'd be willing to drop the counterclaim, he'd be willing to drop the original suit and offer a private cash settlement. He said it could be significant, in the range of $200,000. I picked up my coffee cup and took a slow sip. $200,000. As if that were the number that would make me forget $843,000 in hidden assets. As if I were still the woman who'd walked out of her divorce clutching scraps and calling it a victory. "I appreciate you telling me," I said to Sandra, "but I'm not going to discuss settlement terms outside of my attorney. If Marcus wants to make an offer, Phil Garrett can call David Chen." Sandra looked slightly relieved, as if she'd expected this and was glad to have delivered her message and be done with it. "Of course," she said. I thought you should know." "I do know," I said pleasantly. "Thank you for the coffee." I drove home with the radio off, thinking. The settlement offer, pathetic as it was, told me something important. Marcus was feeling the pressure. The counterclaim had landed. He'd expected me to be frightened and pliable, and instead I'd come back at him with forensic accounting and fraud allegations, and now he was trying to buy his way out cheaply before it got worse. He was scared. That evening, I called Rachel. Rachel Okafor had been my best friend since graduate school. 20 years of each other's company, through moves and jobs and breakups and her own difficult divorce 4 years before mine. She lived in Austin now, but she drove up that Friday evening without being asked twice, arriving with a bottle of good wine and the particular gift she'd always had of knowing when to talk and when to simply be present. We sat in my new living room, fireplace going, and I told her everything. The counterclaim, the shell companies, Marcus's attempted approach through Sandra, all of it. Rachel listened with the focused attention of someone who knows what it feels like to be in a fight like this. She'd been through her own. "He really thought you'd just go away," she said when I finished. "He really did," I said. "What does David say about the trajectory?" "He says the counterclaim has real teeth. The evidence for the hidden assets is solid. The question is whether Marcus tries to settle on actual terms or whether he forces it to trial." Rachel swirled her wine and looked into the fireplace. "He'll try to settle. Men like Marcus, they want to control the narrative. A trial is public. A trial means reporters could pick it up. Business contacts could see it. Clients could—" She stopped. "His reputation is on the line." She was right. I knew she was right. The question was whether his ego would let him see it before it was too late. "How are you doing?" Rachel asked. Not about the case, about me. I thought about it honestly. "Better than I expected," I said. "There's something clarifying about it, about not being afraid of him anymore." "You were never afraid of him." "I was afraid of the chaos," I said, "of the disruption, of losing what I'd built. But—" I looked around at my living room, the high ceilings, the firelight, the sense of space and quiet solidity. "I've already built it." "He can't take that." Rachel raised her glass. "No," she said, "he cannot." We drank to that. The days that followed had a particular texture. Focused, patient, purposeful. David's team was preparing for the next phase. Discovery was ongoing. The forensic report was being formalized into a document that would withstand legal scrutiny. I went to work. I went to my garden. I had dinner with Rachel before she drove back to Austin. I did not contact Marcus. I did not respond to the indirect approach through Sandra. I simply let the legal process do what legal processes do when they're pointed at the truth. I was calm. I was clear-eyed. And I was ready for whatever came next, including the fact that Marcus, realizing soft pressure wasn't working, would soon decide to try something harder. They came on a Saturday morning. I was in the garden with my coffee when I heard the gate buzzer. The security screen showed Marcus's car in the driveway, both of them. I set down my mug, dried my hands on my jeans, and buzzed them in. I met them at the front door. "We wanted to talk," Marcus said. "In person, just as people, without the lawyers." He was using his careful voice, the one he used when he wanted something and knew that demanding it wouldn't work. I'd heard it throughout our marriage, deployed at dinner parties and in difficult negotiations, and I recognized it immediately for what it was. "Come in," I said. We sat in the living room. I didn't offer coffee. Tanya looked around at the room with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and not entirely succeeding. I watched her take in the high ceilings, the furniture I'd chosen slowly and deliberately, the framed photographs of my grandmother Ruth on the side table. "This is a beautiful home," Tanya said. "Thank you," I said. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on knees, in the posture of a man about to be sincere. "Claire, I think we've both let this get away from us. The lawsuit, the counterclaim, this is becoming destructive for everyone. For you, for me, for—" He gestured vaguely. "For everyone who knew us." "Destructive," I said. "I made mistakes," he said, "in the marriage. In the divorce. I know that, but going to court, making all of this public, it doesn't help anyone. It's expensive and it's painful and it ends badly no matter what." I looked at him steadily. What he was describing was true, on the surface. Litigation was expensive and painful. I knew this. I also knew it was a truth he was wielding as a tool, not offering as an acknowledgement. "What are you proposing?" I asked. Tanya crossed her legs and spoke. "A mutual withdrawal. Both suits dropped. You keep the house, obviously. Marcus absorbs his own legal costs. You go your separate ways." She paused. "And the business matter doesn't get discussed publicly." There it was. The mask slipping precisely at the moment she thought it was most fully on. The business matter. The $843,000 in hidden assets. The shell companies. The perjury during our divorce proceedings. She was asking me to bury it. In exchange for... what? Keeping a house I already owned with money that was already legally mine? "You want me to drop a fraud counterclaim," I said slowly, "in exchange for him dropping a lawsuit that has no legal merit to begin with." Marcus shifted. "I wouldn't put it that way." "How would you put it?" "As a fresh start," he said. "For both of us. You have your house. You have your life. Why does this need to go further?" I thought about the settlement I'd accepted 3 years ago. The $380,000 I'd walked away with while Marcus kept a business he'd artificially devalued by hiding nearly $1 million through shell companies. I thought about the months I'd spent in a rental apartment in Lakewood, rebuilding myself on a fraction of what I'd been owed. I thought about the day he'd appeared on my front steps and accused me of hiding assets. "Because it needs to go further," I said. "Because what you did was wrong, Marcus. Not just legally, wrong. You lied under oath. You committed fraud. You took money from our marriage through shell companies, and you made sure I'd never see my fair share. And then when I built something without you, you had the audacity to come here and accuse me of cheating." I held his gaze. "I'm not dropping the counterclaim." Tanya's composure cracked slightly. "You're making a serious mistake," she said. Her voice had lost its smoothness. "This is going to be ugly. We'll fight this. We have resources." "I'm sure you do," I said. "So do I." "Claire," Marcus started. "I think you should leave now," I said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. There was a silence. Then Marcus stood. Tanya stood. They moved toward the door with the particular stiffness of people who had prepared for several outcomes and hadn't prepared for this one. At the door, Marcus turned. Something moved across his face. Not remorse, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something like recognition. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I said. "I have." I closed the door and stood in my entrance hall in the quiet of my house. And then, because I'm human and not made of stone, I pressed my back against the door and let out a long, shaky breath. Fear. Yes. It was there. The awareness of what was coming. The very real possibility that court would be harder than I imagined, that Marcus would find ways to make it worse before it got better. My chest was tight with it, but under the fear, and this was new, this was something I hadn't had 3 years ago, was something solid, something that the fear was actually feeding, the way wind feeds a fire instead of putting it out. Every threat they made, every manipulation they tried, every moment they showed me exactly who they were, added fuel to the certainty that I was doing the right thing. I pushed off the door and walked back to my garden and picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway and looked at the creek moving quietly through the winter light. Let them come. I was ready. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in March. David had requested a summary judgment on Marcus's original claim, the assertion that my trust funds were marital property, arguing that the facts were clear and undisputed enough that no trial was needed on that issue. Judge Patricia Harwell would hear arguments on that motion and on the counterclaim simultaneously. The courtroom on the 6th floor of the George L. Allen Senior Courts Building was smaller than I'd expected, Wood paneling, fluorescent overhead lights, the smell of old paper, and institutional carpet. Marcus arrived with Phil Garrett and a younger associate. I arrived with David and his colleague, a careful woman named Sasha Reeves, who specialized in forensic financial matters. We sat at opposite tables and did not look at each other. Tanya was in the gallery. I saw her when I came in, seated in the back row, dressed as if for a business meeting, her face composed. She'd come to watch, or to support Marcus, or perhaps simply to observe the outcome of the thing she'd helped engineer. Judge Harwell entered at 9:05 and the room stood and settled. She was a compact woman in her late 60s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular unhurried authority of someone who had seen every variation of human behavior across 2 decades on the bench. She read through the case summary without expression and then looked up. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "you're the plaintiff in the original action. Let's start there. What is the legal basis for your claim that the trust funds in question constitute marital property?" Phil Garrett was good. He was practiced and smooth, and he presented his argument with the confidence of someone who'd won similar cases before. He argued that during the course of the marriage, I had known about the trust's existence and had made financial decisions in reliance upon its future value, that the trust had functioned as an anticipated marital resource. He cited 2 cases. He spoke for 18 minutes. Then David stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "the trust in question is an irrevocable trust established by Ruth Elaine Morrison in 2014, 2 years before her death and 7 years before the divorce proceedings in this case. The trust was funded exclusively with Ms. Morrison's personal assets, real property and financial holdings she had accumulated over 4 decades. Ms. Morrison's estate attorney drafted the trust documents to designate Claire Harmon as the sole beneficiary. At no point was Marcus Harmon named as a beneficiary, a co-trustee, or a contingent recipient." He paused. "Texas law is unambiguous on this point. Property acquired by gift or inheritance during a marriage remains the separate property of the recipient spouse, provided it is not commingled with marital funds. The funds from this trust were held in a separate account at Sun State Fiduciary Services in Phoenix. They were never deposited into any joint account. They were never used to pay marital expenses. They were never, in any legal sense, commingled. The disbursement used to purchase the Highland Park property was wired directly from the trust account to the title company." He set down a document. "We have the wire transfer records, the trust instrument, the fiduciary services statements going back 6 years, and the title company records. The sourcing is unambiguous. This money was never marital property." Judge Harwell looked at Phil Garrett. "Counsel, your response to the commingling point?" Phil Garrett began to argue that anticipated reliance was a broader concept. "Mr. Garrett," Judge Harwell said with the quiet patience of someone who has heard this maneuver before, "are you asserting that a spouse's knowledge of an inheritance they did not receive, did not control, and did not have legal access to, transforms that inheritance into marital property?" A pause. A very short, very telling pause. "We are arguing a theory of, I've read the cases you cited," she said. "Neither is directly applicable here. Let me move on." She turned to David. "The counterclaim. Walk me through the evidence." David nodded to Sasha, who distributed a bound document to the judge, opposing counsel, and the court reporter. Then David walked through it, methodically, without drama. The shell companies, the Nevada registrations, the payment records, the comparison between Harmon Construction's actual profit figures and the figures reported during the divorce valuation, the $843,000 discrepancy. Sasha answered 2 questions from the judge about methodology with the precise calm of someone who has never been rattled by a courtroom. I was watching Marcus throughout this. He sat beside Phil Garrett with his hands on the table, perfectly still, too still. The stillness of someone exerting enormous effort to appear calm. And then something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Judge Harwell looked directly at Phil Garrett and said, "Counsel, were you aware of these financial structures during the original divorce proceedings?" Phil Garrett sat very straight. "Your Honor, my client provided all disclosures that were—" "I'm not asking about your client," the judge said. "I'm asking whether you were aware of Briarwood Contracting, LLC, and Pacific Ridge Solutions, LLC, and the pattern of payments outlined in this forensic report." The silence that followed was only about 4 seconds long. It felt longer. "I was not aware of the specifics," Phil Garrett said. His voice was careful in a way that was itself a kind of answer. Beside him, Marcus had gone very slightly pale. Judge Harwell made a note. She asked 2 more questions about the timeline of the Nevada registrations, about the registered agent, and then she said she was going to take a 30-minute recess. In the hallway, David leaned close and said quietly, "That question to Garrett was deliberate. She's exploring whether there's a professional responsibility issue on his side." Meaning? Meaning, if Garrett knew about those entities and represented the valuations as accurate anyway, he has a problem beyond this case. He paused. And Marcus has a much larger problem. I stood in the fluorescent corridor outside courtroom 6 and looked at the scuffed linoleum floor and breathed. When we returned, Marcus dropped his original lawsuit before Judge Harwell reconvened. Phil Garrett submitted the withdrawal on the record. His voice was flat. Marcus stared at the table. Tanya, from the back row of the gallery, had gone very still. The hearing on the counterclaim would continue. But the thing Marcus had started, the thing he'd come to my door to launch with his accusations and his righteousness, was gone. He'd folded it himself in front of a judge and a courtroom and his girlfriend because he had no other choice. I sat at my table and kept my face neutral and felt very quietly something beginning to conclude. Judge Harwell delivered her ruling on the counterclaim 14 days later, in a written opinion that David emailed to me at 8:47 on a Thursday morning. I was in my home office when I read it. Coffee, open windows, March air coming in cool and cedar-scented. The summary judgment on the original claim was granted in full. The trust funds clearly constituted separate property under Texas law. Marcus Harmon's claim was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. She noted, with language that was measured but pointed, that the filing of a lawsuit against clearly separate property raised questions about whether the original action had been brought in good faith. On the counterclaim, she found for me, the evidence from Meridian Forensic Group demonstrated a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation in the financial disclosures submitted during our divorce. Marcus was ordered to pay $420,000 in compensatory damages, the calculated shortfall from the original settlement, plus $85,000 in attorney's fees. Additionally, Judge Harwell referred the matter of potential perjury to the Dallas County District Attorney's Office for review, not a conviction, a referral. But it meant that Marcus Harmon's financial disclosures were now in the hands of prosecutors. I set down the tablet and looked out at the garden. The mockingbirds were loud in the oak tree. I called David. "The DA referral was unexpected," he said. "Harwell doesn't do that lightly." He paused. "Phil Garrett may also have his own issues to navigate with the state bar." Marcus paid the $505,000 voluntarily, wired in 2 installments, 12 days after the ruling. He'd had to liquidate part of his investment portfolio to do it. About 6 weeks later, David called again. Phil Garrett received a letter of inquiry from the Texas State Bar. I didn't gloat. What I felt was a deep, muscular release, something held tightly for too long, finally letting go. I drove to my grandmother's favorite restaurant and had dinner alone at a corner table with a glass of good wine. I ordered what she always ordered. You were right, Grandma Ruth, I thought, about all of it. I drove home through the warm Texas evening to my house, to my garden, to the mockingbirds finally quiet in the oak tree. It was over, and I had won. Spring came to Highland Park suddenly and generously, the way Texas springs do, everything blooming at once. The wisteria along the back fence went purple overnight. I started each morning in the garden with coffee and the specific contentment of someone who has finally found exactly where they are supposed to be. I went back to work, a senior vice president role I'd accepted in January, with a team of 12 and work that challenged me in ways my previous position hadn't. What was different now was the absence of that low-grade anxiety that had shadowed everything during the bad years of the marriage. Work was just work, satisfying, demanding, mine. Rachel came up from Austin in April. We planted herbs and argued about cilantro, and she spent an afternoon on the porch reading while I puttered in the flower beds. Simple, uncomplicated happiness. The kind I'd forgotten was available to me. The $505,000 judgment I divided deliberately. $200,000 into savings, $150,000 donated to a Dallas legal aid organization supporting women through difficult divorces, and $155,000 into renovating the guest house as a rental unit. Ruth Morrison would have approved. I heard things about Marcus, the way you do in a city where circles overlap. The DA's investigation had opened. Harmon Construction was losing clients. Public court records had made partners nervous. His project manager of 10 years had resigned. Tanya had moved out by June, apparently deciding his legal and financial situation was more than she'd bargained for. I felt no particular satisfaction in any of it, just recognition. Structures built on expedience rarely hold. I did not become bitter. The anger that had carried me through the litigation was real, but I'd seen what bitterness does, how you can win everything in a courtroom and still spend 20 years replaying it. I chose not to do that. I was 42 years old and I was home,